There is a long-standing practice, long-standing rule that says if your election day is 90 days away, 89 or plus 1 days away, you're not supposed to be purging your voter rolls. You're not supposed to be engaging in these acts that can really be disruptive for the voters' election experience, electoral experience, because of all the reasons that we have seen sort of play out. But we have seen news coming out of Virginia that's exactly what they're doing. There are a number of states that are engaging in some of this work. Talk to us about some of the examples you've seen this election cycle.
Well, Virginia is really a big one, and it's a case in which people who are purged were alleged to not be citizens. But we also know that there are many examples of people who are citizens and entirely eligible to vote who are on the rolls. And so Virginia Governor
Whoa.
Glenn Youngkin is claiming this as some type of victory for election integrity. It's really a victory for voter suppression and mass confusion.
So these are
And look,
people who actually are American citizens who were purged under some belief that they were not. Had they been naturalized citizens? Were these citizens by birthright? Well, give us a sense as to some of the details there.
in many cases, these are naturalized citizens. These are people also sometimes in some states whose names may match somebody else's name, but there are a
Mm.
whole lot of common names. Like you're a blessed sister with a very unique name, but not everybody has that blessing, right? And so
Right.
some people's name may match somebody else's, and so false assumptions and understandings are made without sufficient verification. But what's really important to know here is that this is not just about good election administration. This is the worst of election administration that we've
Mm.
seen, in part because in Virginia and other places, some election officials are saying, well, we had this information for many months. So why are they waiting until now to
Right.
jump on it? Why are they waiting
Right.
now to try to do a purge when they know it's not prohibited by federal law? We believe it's to sow chaos. We also believe is to try to poke holes in existing federal law that protects us to try to make their way up to what they believe is a Supreme Court that's friendly to them and not to our
Mm.
communities.
I remember when there was at least a couple periods of time, a few eras, where we could look to the Supreme Court to be a protective agency, or I should say, not an agency, a protective source of power for those of us who are seeking to protect voting rights. It seems that day is not today. What has the Supreme Court said about the use of this ability to purge voters so close to the election? Surely they stepped in, and I'm sure Clarence Thomas was among the first to say this is completely unconstitutional.
Well, here's the problem. The court took action and said nothing. You know,
Ah,
this Virginia
oh
case, we won
goodness.
that case in the trial court, in the federal district court. We won on appeal in terms of making sure that voters would be reinstated to the rolls and that the order would take effect. Supreme Court, in an unsigned order by a
Mm,
63 majority, no coincidence, decided that,
wow.
well, we'll put a stay on that. The ruling will not take effect, so voters will not be reinstated. So at least 1,600 have been purged, and there certainly could be more.
Now, in the state of Virginia, from what I've seen thus far, please correct me if I'm wrong. The one fix or the one hope that they have is that Virginia has, and I don't know if it's still valid as of today's date, but they had up until at least a few days ago same day voter registration. Do you know if that's still in place? So if that you were a part of this group of more than 1,500 folks who were purged, do you still have the ability to register and vote in this current election?
I'm so glad you mentioned that. You know, there are a number of jurisdictions, including the Washington D.C., that do have same-day voter registration
Mm,
on election day, and so that is a recourse for Virginia voters. We're very grateful for. It's the kind of thing that we've advocated for. Frankly, it should be nationwide. There shouldn't be
that's right.
barriers to people voting, and it's frankly easier for everyone. And so that is a fail safe in Virginia for people who are citizens, people who believe they would otherwise be eligible. You can still go to the polls, register, and cast your ballot the same day in those jurisdictions.
Thank goodness. Now, one of the things that I've seen that has caused a lot of folks some concern is the fact that, leading up into tomorrow, record numbers of early vote. I'm so happy that I got my early vote sticker.
Yes.
Although it didn't say Brooklyn on it, so I feel like I'm missing out on the comparison between the boroughs. That's all right. I'm gonna leave it alone. But for people who were early voting, there's been a lot of confusion because there has been an expectation that those votes are being counted right now, and for a lot of jurisdictions, that's just simply not the case. Even though it is something that I know a number of Democratic legislators across the country have been fighting for to, and I know even in New York we have rules that for a long time that prevented us from being able to count those ballots that were cast early before election day. Talk to us about what you're anticipating in terms of the length of time it's going to take to count those ballots, and why is it that counting ballots as they come in seems to be so controversial for folks?
Well, you know, in some states, including Pennsylvania, which is a known problem, the canvass or the counting of ballots can't start until after the polls close, or at least on election day. And
Right.
so that means that it can be days. So the more people vote by mail or more people do the early voting, the longer it's going to take to actually do the tabulations. Now, states like Pennsylvania prepare for it, but in conversations I've had with former secretaries of state, they really would prefer that the legislature would take action so that the count can start ahead of time. There's no need to leave the nation in suspense.
Right.
It's
Right.
just one of those common sense things that really should change. But what's
Wow.
important is for folks to understand, look, it is not uncommon in this day and age for people, for us rather, not to know the final results of an election on election day. It
Right.
actually, people think about, oh, in other countries it takes days or weeks. Sometimes it takes that here too. Remember the 2020 election, there was a runoff even in Georgia and Louisiana as
That's
well, but I
right.
think it was Georgia that tipped the balance in terms of political control, partisan
Yeah.
control over the Senate. So people should really strap in, buckle up uh, after you cast your ballot, and make sure that you keep your head on the swivel and manage all the emotions, because there will be emotions.
That's right. We start our show every day with a moment of gratitude, and the
Mm,
theme for this week is we walking by faith, and we gonna be all right no matter what happens. We got each other, we got the ancestors. We gonna be all right. But we also have lawyers who know what they got to do and who know what time it is. And so going into tomorrow, some of the things that causing a little bit of concern for folks in the audience, and just as I'm watching the news and some of the socials, is seeing some of the incidences of violence that have taken place at some of the polls already. There was this white gentleman in a MAGA hat in South Carolina who was very disrespectful to a room of poll workers, all of whom were black women. And I have a theory that in the next major election, we, the organizers, and we, the attorneys, need to make some collaborations between our street organizations, which are extraordinarily well organized, and our elders, so that we can have some protection for these folks as they are navigating the polls. But we're seeing a number of concerns about actions taken at poll sites that are designed to be threatening. We have someone who has called into the show. She's been a listener for a long time. Her name is Miss Esla. She lives in San Bernardino, California. Or county rather, in California, and she is called, and we've had 2 conversations with her because of the absolute fear that she has because of some of the threatening things that she's been subjected to as an elderly woman, one of the only black people in her community, one of the only black poll workers or poll workers of color in her community.
mm.
What can be done to keep, from a legal perspective, to keep people who are either working at the polls or people who are just simply showing up to vote who are facing intimidation? Where is the Department of Justice? Should there be federal monitors dispersed under the 1965 Voting Rights Act or some other legislation? What's your take on what's happening in order to keep people physically safe as they're exercising the right to vote?
Well, you hit the nail on the head. Through the at the Lawyers Committee, we co-lead the Election Protection Coalition. We have the 866 Our Vote Voter Protection Hotline, and there are a number of calls that have come in from multiple states. And I'll call out Texas and North
Mm,
Carolina in particular, with calls about voter intimidation, improper electioneering, or pressuring of folks. And so, in terms of what can and should be done, state law really prohibits electioneering within a certain zone, right? A
mm,
certain intimidation. But there's also the Voting Rights Act, Section 11B of the Voting Rights Act prohibits any effort to intimidate people from voting, not just state governments, but private actors as well. We actually
right.
filed and won a lawsuit under that provision of the Voting Rights Act stemming from the 2020 election when 2 guys sent 85,000 robocalls with misleading information. So
Mm,
that was disinformation designed to intimidate, but you could also intimidate someone in person as well. And so, the last time I testified before Congress, or maybe the time before last, I spoke about how what's bad for poll workers can also be bad for voters,
right.
especially when you're in a majority black precinct, for example. The poll workers are probably going to be black or mostly black. The voters are
Yep.
going to be mostly black folks. And so anything that's going to sow confusion for voters makes it harder for poll workers. Anything that's intimidating poll workers is going to make it harder for voters to feel like it's actually a safe space. And so we do need DOJ monitors. Unfortunately,
Mm,
our champion for voting rights in the Department of Justice, Kristen Clark, who leads the Civil Rights Division, announced just a few days ago that DOJ is deploying poll monitors to a number of jurisdictions. Now, this is
oh,
not a required thing for states to accept these monitors. Texas has already said that they will reject the monitors. But what
mm.
I'm
I
told
think
is
I
that
saw
those
that in
poll,
Florida too. Like
that's
Florida,
right.
Governor Santos had said the same thing. Yeah.
That's right. We're told that those poll monitors will be on their flights and they're probably on the ground already. And so there will be a test tomorrow about who gets access and who does not. And then perhaps a political battle thereafter about what denial of access really does mean.